that intelligence was an inequality, that it had a large hereditary component, and that so-called IQ tests could measure this inequality. The implicit message was that IQ characterizes something essential and unchanging about human nature, our inherited intelligence. The next milestone in intelligence testing was the work of this man, psychologist David Wechsler. In 1939, Wechsler designed a new test to solve a major problem of intelligence tests in general, their dependence on language, a problem for non-English speakers and small children. So he developed new nonverbal sections to go along with the verbal sections. In this example, test takers are asked to put these pictures in a logical sequence. Since the development of the original Wechsler intelligence scales in 1939, later revisions have become the most frequently used assessment tool in the country. More than 3 million people a year take it. Psychological testing has become a big business in America. There are thousands of psychologists whose main work revolves around using them. But how do we know if they do what they're supposed to do? A good place to start is to ask, what is it that makes a test valuable to a tester? Here at Howard University, the late William Curtis Banks looked at potential misuse and racial bias in aptitude testing.
A test, first and foremost, has to be valid. The test has to be able to be demonstrated to measure what it is that you're interested in. If it is intended to measure the ability of a young person to do well in college, then the test should yield a score which actually predicts how well the person does in college. If the test is intended to predict how well an individual can perform a job, let's say of a police lieutenant, then the test score should actually predict and should be consistent with the individual's ability to actually perform that job when he is in it. Secondly, the test needs to be reliable, because in order to be valid, it needs to measure whatever it is we're interested in the same way each time it's used. And three, we need to be careful in standardizing the test to make sure that the people that we use to establish its initial validity and reliability are the same people that we're going to use the test with to measure later on.
So not only do the tests themselves have to be assessed, we also have to assess how they're used or misused. Alfred Binet's dream, which is still shared by many, was that psychological assessment would replace subjective biased evaluations with objective ones. In the United States, testing has been championed as a democratic tool to eliminate arbitrary and biased evaluations of people based on such irrelevant criteria as race, sex, nationality, social class, and physical appearance. But these lofty goals are often lost when test results become not the keys to the kingdom, but a passport to nowhere. There is no area of psychology more enmeshed in controversy than that of assessment.
The way that competency tests have been used in a biased way in the past, and currently in some instances, is by using the results of them to tell us that certain people are not really capable of doing something when they actually are. The reason why the tests tell us that sometimes is because they have been developed in such a way as not to take full account of the different ways, in some instances, in which different people do the same job.
Many educators also worry about the problem of teaching for tests instead of for basic knowledge.
It's not that we're concerned if people are able to do well at the test. What we're concerned about is if they're able to do well at the test, but they're not able to do well at anything else. And if they're coached specifically for the test, regardless of whether we're talking about a test in the area of vocations or in the area of education, then we end up with a measure on the test that tells us not what we really want to know, and that is, can this person do something in the rest of the world outside of the test situation?
Think about what happens when a test score begins to define a person. I'm a C student with 100 IQ, as if it's indelibly stamped on the forehead. Does that kind of labeling then become a self-fulfilling prophecy?
Or can generally held beliefs about a person's gender,
race, or age influence a person's performance. Psychologist Claude Steele of Stanford University studies the effect labeling and stereotypes can have on a person's ability to perform in a given situation. He calls this phenomenon stereotype threat.
Stereotype threat it is a situational threat. It's usually tied to the social aspects of the situation you're in, and it's just the sense that you could be judged in terms of some stereotype about an identity that you have, your racial identity, your age, your sex.
We don't have to believe in a stereotype. Merely knowing that others could judge us because of our social identity is enough to distort our performance. One of the pivotal studies Steele conducted was testing women's performance when compared to men on standardized math exams.
There is in our society a stereotype that women have a limited ability to perform especially difficult math. And so a woman taking a difficult standardized exam in math, when she experiences frustration, that stereotype becomes relevant as a possible interpretation of the frustration, both for her and for anybody who's going to see or interpret her performance. And that makes the experience of taking the test different for her than it does for a man in precisely the same situation.
Hi, are you two here for the psych study?
Our interest there was to see if you brought women and men who were both very skilled in math and very dedicated to being good at math into the laboratory and you gave them a very difficult math test, how would they perform? Our prediction was that the women would not perform as well as the men because they would be under stereotype threat. The men wouldn't be in this situation. And that's exactly what happened. Our prediction is that if you could turn the spotlight of stereotype threat off, their performance should go up to match that of equally skilled men in this situation. We take the threat out of the situation in a very simple, straightforward way. Just before people get ready to take the test, we sit them down and say, on this particular test, this is not a test that's capable of discriminating between men and women's performance. It never has, it never will. The stereotype is now almost magically made irrelevant to her performance here. And when we create that situation, women's performance goes up dramatically on this test to match that of equally skilled men in this situation. So that's the kind of evidence we use to give us a sense of how this process, the stereotype threat phenomenon, just being subject to being seen that way, can actually affect a very important performance in a person's life.
In the view of Alfred Binet, intelligence is a dynamic cognitive process. But unfortunately, many of the psychometricians who followed have seen intelligence as a single trait, which is accurately measured by intelligence tests and which can predict certain kinds of academic and vocational performance. In the last few years, however, cognitive scientists like Howard Gardner of Harvard have given us new perspectives on intelligence.
The theory arose because of dissatisfaction on my part with the view of intelligence as being just one thing which you could measure with an IQ test. And if you look around the world and you think about all the different kinds of things that people can do well that are valued in different cultures, one seems pretty simple-minded. And after a lot of analysis, I came up with a list of 7 intelligences. The first one is linguistic intelligence. It's a kind of ability that a poet or writer or arter would have. The second intelligence I call logical mathematical. As the name implies, it's what you'd find in a mathematician, logician,